Unrelenting, the story of the Australasian Antarctic expedition of 1911 to 1914. In mid-January 1913, Douglas Mawson was probably the loneliest man on Earth. He was in an unexplored part of Adelie Land in Antarctica, and, by his reckoning, he was around 150 kilometres from the safety of his hut, and, hopefully, the other members of the 1911 Australasian Antarctic expedition. But he wasn't even sure if anyone was still there. They might have already left on the rescue ship to escape the approaching winter. As bad as the loneliness was, though, it wasn't going to kill him. But hunger, exposure, exhaustion, illness and injury very well might. And Mawson was experiencing them all, in a place he described as the most wonderful and terrible place on Earth. His equipment and provisions were meagre, especially for such a long journey that faced him. He had a makeshift tent that was held up by repurposed ski poles, and a worn-out sled that was difficult to pull, especially since he had killed and eaten the last of his sled dogs a fortnight previously. Other than the last remaining dog sinews, Mawson's food stocks were almost completely depleted. So much so that each day he counted out individual raisins to make sure he wouldn't run out too soon. Due to his hunger, exertion and the hostile climate, Mawson's health was failing. His toes had turned black and the nails were falling out. He had sores and rashes across his whole body. His hair was falling out and he'd had to bandage one of his eyes due to snow blindness. Yet despite all of these ailments, the thing which troubled him the most were the soles of his feet. A few days previously, as he had slogged along, he noticed his feet felt unusually lumpy. So he stopped and took off his boots and socks, and discovered the entire soles had detached from the rest of his foot, exposing the raw and sensitive flesh underneath. Each day since then, Mawson had put the sole back in place and then bandaged it tightly to keep it there. Next he put on 6 pairs of socks before putting on his boots. Every morning, Mawson packed up his possessions and tent and stowed them on his sled, something that under normal circumstances might count as a minor consideration, but for Mawson, this was a cold, energy-sapping 4-hour endeavour, and it would take him another 4 hours to make camp again at the end of the day, with that campsite possibly only a couple of kilometres away if the terrain or weather were bad. On the 17th of January, having packed everything away, he settled himself into the harness, wincing as the leather straps bit into his shoulders, rubbed raw from the many previous times he'd had to do this, and he began his slow day's trek towards salvation. He was heading up a sharp incline when his foot broke through the surface layer of snow, and he fell into a hidden crevasse. This was not unexpected, and had happened many times before, so he'd learned to tie a rope around his waist, linking him with his sled. This time, however, the fall was longer, and he found himself dangling at the end of the rope, spinning slowly over a gaping, silent abyss. Mawson hauled himself, painfully and slowly, up the rope to the relative safety of the sled. As he got to the lip of the crevasse and began pulling himself out, the shelf gave way under his weight, plunging him again into the empty space below. But for Douglas Mawson, this was neither the end nor the beginning of his story. Chapter 1. Beginnings. Douglas Mawson was born on the 5th of May 1882 in Yorkshire, England, but his family emigrated to Australia when he was 2 years old. His father, Robert Mawson, was always on the move, from one get-rich-quick scheme to another, and it was one such scheme that prompted the move to Australia in the first place. Douglas Mawson showed early enthusiasm for the natural sciences and exploration, with his mother once remarking that his adventurous nature was evident from as early as 2 years old. At the end of his final year at school, the headmaster is reported to have said, quote, "If there be a corner of this planet of ours still unexplored, Douglas Mawson will be the organiser and leader of an expedition to unveil its secrets." He went to university and got an engineering degree in Sydney in 1902, before switching to geology and getting a job at the University of Adelaide. While here, he met Professor Edgeworth David, who would become hugely influential in Lawson's life and career. In 1907, David was invited to join Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition to Antarctica. He asked Mawson to join him, an opportunity Mawson jumped at enthusiastically. As part of this expedition, the two men, along with the Scottish scientist Alistair Mackay, became the first people to ascend Mount Erebus. Later, they attempted to be the first people to reach the South Magnetic Pole. The three men, pulling a single sled and sleeping in a single three-man sleeping bag, travelled over 1,000 kilometres in 10 weeks and arrived at their destination on January 16, 1909. The physical toll of such a journey was felt most by Edgeworth David, who was nearly 50 years of age at the time. As such, Mawson assumed authority of the group for the return journey. In all, the men travelled over 2,000 kilometres. While there is some doubt as to whether their endpoint was the actual location of the magnetic pole at the time, it was still a remarkable achievement, and the journey held the record for the longest trek of man-pulled sleds for over 70 years. The experience sparked Mawson's imagination for the southernmost continent, and brought his name to the attention of other explorers, such as Shackleton and Captain Robert Scott. Mawson didn't want to merely join their expeditions, however. He wanted to lead one of his own. Mawson looked at the map of Antarctica, and what interested him most was the land directly to the south of Australia, a largely unknown section spanning over 3,000 kilometres. It was an area he called the Great Southern Land, or even his land of hope and glory. It was an area about which only the barest knowledge had been uncovered. Mawson believed that from a scientific perspective, this would be the area most beneficial to explore. He also felt that Australians should have a particular interest in investigating this territory. An Australian-led expedition, he thought, would raise the nation's profile and show that Australia was the equal of other nations in the realm of scientific exploration. Additionally, he believed that Australia had as much right, if not more right, as Antarctica's closest neighbour to claim territory in the name of the British Crown. He sought financial backers in Australia, impressing upon them the scientific value of an expedition, as well as it being probably the last opportunity Australia would have of exploring and mapping anywhere on Earth outside of Australia. Despite his pleas, and even with the support of his old mentor Edgeworth David, Mawson struggled to get the finances he required. However, David set up a meeting with Shackleton to try to gain his support. Mawson was so successful at outlining the expedition's aims and objectives that initially Shackleton thought the proposal was so good that he decided he wanted to lead it, with Mawson along as a science officer. This was precisely what Mawson had not wanted, but Shackleton soon became more interested in other expedition ideas. He did, however, offer his support to Mawson and suggested potential crew members, as well as petitioning the British government for funding for Mawson's expedition. Mawson also sought assistance from Captain Robert Scott. Scott was in the process of planning his own trip to Antarctica, including his attempt to be the first to reach the South Pole. He met with Mawson and offered him a position as science officer for the South Pole expedition. Mawson had asked if he could be chief science officer, but Scott declined. However, Scott had heard of his earlier exploits in Antarctica and the impressive feat of attaining the South Magnetic Pole, and offered Mawson a position on the small team that would make the attempt on the pole, along with a quite substantial amount of money. Mawson declined. He wanted to lead a scientific expedition, and felt his own proposal was better than the half-hearted way Scott appeared to treat the scientific aspect of the trip. If Mawson had agreed to go with Scott, then it is probable he would have died along with Scott in their tent as they tried to make it back from the pole. With the combined support of Shackleton, Scott and David, Mawson finally received the financial backing he required. Mawson's plans for his expedition were ambitious and included a large number of different scientific objectives and would involve around 30 men, mostly scientists, travelling to and living in Antarctica. 5 men would be left on remote Macquarie Island to establish and operate a radio station that would provide the Australian mainland with weather updates, as well as serving as a staging point for the men in Antarctica to keep in contact with Australia. No one had ever established radio communication in Antarctica before, and this was considered an invaluable contribution to the expedition. The remainder of the men would be split into 2 different parties. The main group, of 18, would land in Cape Denison, Adelie Land, and establish their base there. The western party, of 8 men, would continue along the coast to the west and then establish a base at a suitable location. Both groups would conduct scientific experiments from the huts over winter before a number of 3-man expeditions would head out to map and study the surrounding areas. So Mawson's next task was to assemble his team. Chapter 2. London. Mawson began his search for crew members in London, with many of the people he approached and recruited being from recommendations from Shackleton, from Scott, and from his old mentor Professor Edgeworth David. One of the first people Mawson hired was Frank Wild. Wild was an extremely experienced sailor and polar explorer, having sailed on Scott's Discovery expedition in 1901, and with Shackleton, and Mawson himself, on the Nimrod expedition in 1908. Mawson joked by referring to Wild as the oldest resident of Antarctica. Mawson would later choose Wild to lead the Western Base expedition, the smaller of the 2 base camps. Part of Mawson's ambitious plans for Antarctica included taking a plane and using it to undertake survey work. Such a plan required recruiting a pilot and an engineer. Hugh Watkins was brought on board as the pilot, and Frank Bickerton as the expedition's mechanical engineer. Bickerton had never been to the Antarctic, but was a keen explorer, having recently arrived back in Britain after an unsuccessful attempt to find buried pirate treasure on some islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. While in London, Mawson also recruited the 2 men who would be in charge of the expedition's 50 sled dogs. The first of these was a young army lieutenant called Belgrave Ninnis. Ninnis had no experience with dogs or with the Antarctic, but came recommended by Captain Robert Scott, and he was a skilled surveyor. Ninnis had been keen to join an Antarctic expedition and follow in the footsteps of his father as a polar explorer. Ninnis was to be assisted with the dogs by Dr. Xavier Mertz, a champion skier from Switzerland. Like Ninnis, Mertz had no experience handling dogs, but Mawson believed his other skills would be assets, including his skiing, his mountaineering background, and his doctorate in glacier formation. Mawson only recruited a small number of the team in London, as he was keen to preserve the Australasian aspect of the expedition, and was determined to recruit the majority of the team once he got to Australia. However, what he did need was a ship, and a captain to sail her. Mawson recruited John King Davis as ship's master and second in command of the whole expedition. Like Frank Wild, John King Davis was extremely experienced, having been chief officer on board the Nimrod during Shackleton's recent expedition. Shackleton himself described Davis as, quote, the best navigator and sailor that ever went into the Antarctic. Initially, Mawson had hoped to purchase a purpose-built Antarctic expedition ship, such as Scott's Discovery or Shackleton's Nimrod. Instead, however, he purchased an old whaling ship called the Aurora. Given the drastic change in use of the vessel, John King Davis supervised an extensive overhaul of the ship, both inside and out. On July 28, 1911, the Aurora was loaded up with over 3,000 tons of equipment and supplies and 48 sled dogs from Greenland, and set sail from London to Sydney. Chapter 3. Australia. The journey south took 3 months. The dogs had many puppies on the way, with 13 pups being born on a single day alone. However, many of the young dogs did not survive for long. either succumbing to the intense heat, or being washed overboard, or even being eaten by one of the other adult dogs. Mertz and Ninnis were not sailors, and Captain Davis was initially extremely scathing of them both in his diary. However, as the journey went on, their willingness to learn and their high work ethic began to impress him. And the captain was not an easy man to impress or to get on the good side of. His nickname was Gloomy for his reserved nature and nearly overwhelming sense of responsibility. Davis described himself in his diary as, quote, charged with the safety of the ship, her cargo, and those who served her, doomed to that loneliness and austerity inseparable from command. Upon arrival in Australia, Mawson was reunited with his fiancée, Paquita Del Prat. Mawson and Paquita had first met in 1909 at a garden party. She had been 17 and he 27. Initially, Paquita's father was extremely reluctant to allow Mawson to court his daughter, partly because of Mawson's father, who had never stuck at anything for long. Mawson wrote the man a 7-page letter requesting his consent in Mawson marrying his daughter. In the letter, he impressed upon the man how he wasn't like his father and had never failed at anything he'd ever started. Paquita's father said that he did not approve of Mawson, but would not stand in the way of his daughter's happiness, and the two were engaged the following year. Mawson included Paquita in the planning of his expedition and would go over the inventory lists with her. She was amazed at how much food was going to be taken to Antarctica, a total of 16 tons. As large a volume of food as this was, it wasn't to be all the food eaten on the expedition. Their supplies were to be supplemented by whatever the men could forage, such as seal meat and penguin eggs. The food that was taken was mostly tinned or dried. To reduce the risk of scurvy, the provisions included lots of cans of fruit and vegetables, tons of fresh potatoes, chocolate, cocoa, flour, sauces, ham, cereal meals, custard powder, malted milk, and so-called fancy biscuits were also carefully selected and packed. And of course, the provisions included much wine and whiskey. Warm clothing was essential, and it was determined that the best boots were made from the fur on a reindeer's leg, as this is the toughest and is resistant to snow. The insides of the boots were lined with sennegrass, a type of Scandinavian grass, that kept the boots warm, even when wet. Gloves and footwear were made of animal skins, such as wolfskin for mitts. Clothing was layered with woolen all-in-one undergarments, with waterproof jackets and trousers over the top. Mawson had a huge amount of work ahead of him to get the expedition ready, and his main focus while in Sydney was to recruit the remainder of his team. Soon he had found himself such as the expedition's chief magnetician, New Zealander Eric Webb, and the main base's meteorologist, Cecil Madigan. Madigan had requested, and been granted, a deferment to a Rhodes Scholarship to be able to join the expedition. There was a lot of interest in being part of the expedition, and Mawson, being as busy as he was getting everything else organised, was often only able to give people a short period of time in their interview. It is said that photographer Frank Hurley learned of Mawson's travel plans on the day of his interview and booked himself onto the same train that he knew Mawson was catching to get into the city to interview Hurley. Once Hurley located Mawson on board, he sat next to him and began his attempts to impress Mawson to hire him. Hurley was offered the position of expedition photographer, perhaps as a result of his ingenuity. In his interview, geologist Charles Lazeron's first question by Mawson was, "Can you cook?" Lazeron admitted that his first efforts of cooking on an expedition was probably still in the bush in a state of semi-petrification. After his interview, he heard nothing for a long time until a message arrived from Mawson instructing him to collect some equipment in Sydney and to ship it to Hobart. He was also asked to learn how to skin birds, and this was how Lazeron learned he'd been appointed the expedition's taxidermist. While preparing for the journey south, the pilot Watkins went out in the plane with Frank Wild, the man Mawson had earmarked to be the leader of the Western Base Group. The flight ended badly when the plane crashed, resulting in minor injuries to Watkins and to Wild, The plane, however, would never fly again. No longer needing a pilot, Mawson sent Watkins back to England, but decided to keep the remains of the plane, now referred to as the Tractor, and to take it to Antarctica to help move supplies around. While in Australia, Ninnis and Mert spent much of their time with the dogs at a nearby quarantine station. This gave them a lot of time to think about their upcoming journey further south and the risks they might face. Ninnis wrote in his diary about his fears of sledging in Antarctica, saying, quote, "I might go over a crevasse and be badly smashed up, absolutely out of the reach of help. In my humble opinion, suicide would be right. It would certainly be preferable. I intend to take a small pack of cyanide tablets to use in such an emergency." The other men were all busy learning new skills in preparation for their assigned roles on the expedition or helping to load the Aurora. After little more than a month in Australia, the expedition was ready to leave. On the day of departure, there was considerable excitement on the wharves, for the expedition itself and for Antarctic exploration in general, as Amundsen and Scott were both already racing to the South Pole. With a band playing and guns being fired in salute, Australia's Premier and the Governor of Tasmania both boarded the ship to say goodbye. Also coming on board to farewell the expedition was Russian ballet dancer Anna Pavlova. Belgrave Ninnis got a signed photograph from her, which became one of his most cherished possessions on the expedition. A young pup that had been born on the trip south from London was named Pavlova in her honour. One noticeable absence from the farewell was Paquita. She had been convinced to stay away by Mawson and by her mother, who had said she would have been too emotional. It is said that she regretted this decision and wished she had been there to farewell the expedition and her beloved Douglas in person. Before he left Australia, Mawson wrote to her referencing this expedition and his previous one to Antarctica. He said, quote, "You may be sure that I am going away this time far happier than last time, when there was no gem of priceless worth awaiting my return." On the 2nd of December 1911, 31 men sailed south from Australia. 5 would be stationed on Macquarie Island, 18 in the main base, and a further 8 in the western base. Most of the men were in their early to mid-20s, and at the time of departure, expedition leader Douglas Mawson was just 30 years old, and John King Davis, the ship's master and expedition second in command, was 28.